Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm going to start in a few seconds to let other people join the call. Okay, people are still streaming in, so I'll give it another 15 seconds. All right, well, good afternoon. uh, my name's Ignacio Dairit. I'm with the Center for Creative Land Recycling, and I am joined by Miriam Tasnif Abasi with the Department of Toxic Substances Control and Noemi Emmerich Ford with the US EPA. And we're here to talk about two valuable resources for sustainable infill development, especially affordable housing. So, yes, go ahead, Noemi. Thanks. So, before I go into details about the money, let's talk about the land. So, we're talking about mostly what are called brownfields grants. And the formal definition of a brownfield is on your screen, but really there's a practical definition of this, which Noemi will be plugging later. It's really a property that is eligible for brownfields incentives from the state and the federal government. And there are nuances from this. There are slightly different definitions, but affordable housing sites as infill tend to be those that are, uh, uh, you know, have a very great chance of being eligible. Because our goal here is to reuse abandoned, vacant, or underutilized properties for beneficial use. So, what does this mean? It could be a vacant building, it could be a dry cleaner, it could be actually a field that's in the middle of a neighborhood, it could be anything. And so there are federal resources and state resources so that you can use for due diligence, some community outreach, and some planning that you can use especially for your affordable housing projects. And that's why we're here. And Noemi and Miriam represent the agencies that provide this funding, and the Center for Creative Land Recycling, or CCLEAR, provides free technical assistance under both programs. Can you please click through, Noemi? So another more misconceptions about brownfields grants. That some people think it has to be a Superfund site or it has to be contaminated. That's not the case. Again, it could be idled and a site that is intended for some reuse. It doesn't have to be on a list. It doesn't have to be on the DTSC list or the Regional Water Quality Control list or on the LA County Fire Department list. It doesn't have to be on a list. Uh, it can be anything. Uh, these sites may be suitable for housing. If it's a vacant field, you might not know that there was a historic use that you do not want to obtain that any liabilities associated with it. So you really do need what's called a phase one, an all appropriate inquiry phase one, almost anytime you touch a site. So that's why these grants are useful. And what entities are eligible? Most of you on this call are local governments, school districts, special districts, tribes, and nonprofits, and that's where you come in. Next slide. So I'm going to hand it off to Miriam now, who's going to talk about the state initiatives for environmental justice. So take it away, Miriam.
Great. Thank you so much, Ignacio. And I'm so happy to be here to talk to you a little bit about the new funding that we have and how it can help with infill development. So in about 6 months ago, in July of last year, DTSC, the Department of Toxic Substances Control, was given this really amazing opportunity to get more involved and have some funding behind helping clean up in vulnerable communities. It's called the Clean Up in Vulnerable Communities Initiative. So we had a $500 million infusion to prioritize the to prioritize properties in vulnerable and disadvantaged communities. So we've got several programs all in various stages of development, and the program I'm going to talk about today represents the biggest piece of the 500 million, which is the Equitable Community Revitalization Grant. This is more just for anyone who wants more information. This provides a breakdown of all the different programs, but I'm going to skip over that and not cause any more pain to anyone's eyes. So we have about, in this grant, over 250 million available over the next 3 years. As Ignacio mentioned, our grants are available to local governments and public entities, tribes, and nonprofits. And these are for the properties that are considered to be vulnerable and historically disadvantaged. And the key is that the entire ethos behind this grant is to take fallow, underutilized land and return it to productive and beneficial uses for the communities. So we have 3 types of grants that we are offering: community-wide assessments, which are very similar to the programs that US EPA offers that Noemi is going to talk about in a little bit more detail; site-specific investigations; and site-specific cleanups. And as you can see, the grants, the funding available for each type is different. So up to 300,000 available for community-wide assessments, 3 million available for investigations, 7 million available for cleanups. And generally, the requirements are that the applicant must either own or have access to the properties in order to be able to perform the eligible activities, all within a 2-year time frame. We have a clock on our money, and therefore we're pushing our grantees and are structuring our grants in a way that the environmental work, gets done within a 2-year time frame. So for community-wide assessments, the whole goal is to obtain information about environmental conditions at least 4 or more properties within an area. Community-wide assessments can be used to really be the first step in understanding the environmental conditions, like phase 1s, for example. They can also be used for looking into a deeper understanding of how the environmental impacts can be addressed in order to allow the properties to be used for whatever proposed use. And engagement activities associated with the work and the planning can also be picked up as part of a community-wide assessment. For site-specific investigations, this is more for one site. This usually happens when you have more specific plans associated with the site and you have some sense of what is needed. Even though phase 1s or AAI packages are considered to be the first step, there are sometimes, because of knowledge of the history of the reuse of historical use of the site, I should say, that you need to do site assessments, phase 1, phase 2, PEAs. So all of these environmental investigations that have several different labels are all part of the environmental investigation process, including designing what the cleanup is. And so we anticipate that or have designed these investigations to take it all the way up to the development and approval of a cleanup plan. So it actually has a pretty wide range of activities that can be covered under that up to $3 million cap. For site-specific cleanups, the way we envision it is that you pick up a environmental cleanup plan that either was approved already or is very near approval, and you can go ahead and use the ECRG to ask for funding to implement that plan. It does cover a wide range of cleanups. You know, we think of cleanup, when we say cleanups, we actually use the word cleanups and mitigation interchangeably. So something like a vapor barrier, for example, which is a longer term component of a system, that is something that we definitely can fund under a cleanup grant. And, a lot of the urban infill areas, we are finding out, I think over the past few years, that small dry cleaning facilities have caused a lot of vapor impact. And so vapor barriers, we're seeing more and more being used in residences. And that is definitely something that we can cover under the environmental cleanup grant. And it includes, the thing that we don't cover are building materials, because our grants are tied into our jurisdiction and our regulatory authority. Things that like methane and lead and asbestos in building materials are things that we don't cover. Although I did want to point out that if lead from building materials has impacted the soil or the groundwater underneath the structure, then that becomes something that is returned back into our jurisdiction. So there's a lot that we can cover in this particular grant with that ceiling of $7 million. I wanted to share with you sort of what we're using to decide, what a vulnerable community is. We another state office, OHIA, I think it's the Office of Environmental Health and Hazard Assessment, and I might be completely wrong. We'll have to look that up. Ignacio, maybe if you can look that up and put that in the chat, I'd appreciate it. So they have a database that they've built called CalEnviroScreen, which is a layering of demographic data, census data over various different sources of pollution-based data that they've overlaid, and they come up with a percentile score. The higher the CalEnviroScreen percentile score, the more vulnerable to pollution, or the higher the pollution burden of that particular community is. And so in this map that we have up on the screen, this shows the areas within California that have a CalEnviroScreen or percentile score of greater than 75%, which is the focus area for our grant. We are not completely closed to CES scores of less than 50%, but they are disfavored in the process. But we do recognize that there are rural communities, tribal communities, and other types of communities that have vulnerable populations where the CES score may not reflect that correctly. And that's why when we were given direction to build this grant, even though the emphasis was on the CES scores of 75% and higher, we are still allowed to evaluate vulnerable communities from the lower scores as well. This, of course, is a competitive process, and just in case anyone is curious, we don't actually give anyone funds. It is a reimbursement-based grant, and this is just a zooming in on the large swaths of areas within Southern California, in LA, in the IE, and in Orange County that have the really high CalEnviroScreen scores, just so you have a better understanding of what that looks like in our area. And so we recently, in December, closed out a pre-qualification. Maybe if you can click on, I think maybe at least 1 or 2 times, everything will pop in. And so because this was a new grant for us, we ran a pre-qualifying round just to understand what the interest was and what the distribution would be, to give us a better understanding of what our numbers would look like in the actual full application once it was released. And so in our pre-qual, we received 143 million ask, about 88 applications, mainly from public entities, but we had nonprofits and tribes represented there as well, with a distribution of 51 cleanup applications, 30 investigation, and 7 community-wide assessments, with the average request of a little over $1.5 million. And this was really interesting for us to learn, because it helped us get a little bit of a finger on the pulse of who's interested in our money. So this is probably a slide that's best maybe look at a little bit carefully on, on your own time, where you can zoom in and out. But as you can see from the map on the left-hand side, uh, the, the largest number of applications were clustered in the urban Los Angeles and Northern California areas. We did have a smattering of applications, as you can see, in the far north, and one kind of generally centrally located. But even with the zoom in, you can take a little bit of closer look as to where these applicants are, and a lot of them, I think the most number of applications we received were for various applicants who were looking for funding to build affordable homes. So we had, here, actually, this is where this is where we have those stats. So you can see the percentile distribution. The most number of applications came from the highest Calorie Screen Score areas, and I think we had 47 applications where affordable housing was a component of their proposed reuse, with 18 of those being solely for affordable housing. And there's mixed income housing, park and open space, public schools, and commercial retail. So, just a fact that's little known is that when this money was originally being talked about to be provided to DTSC, it was originally set up as a grant that would be solely focused on making land available for affordable housing. But things got changed somewhere along the way. And so even though everyone recognizes that affordable housing is a really, really important and critical need for our state, we opened up the application to a much broader audience. But we could see that based on the applications we received, affordable housing definitely is up there in how people want to use these funds once they clear the land. We had some really great applications. We had a site in Richmond that wanted to build a bunch of like family affordable homes. There's nonprofit for affordable home combination and a retail space with a small park. I think it was the LA County Parks and Recreation submitted 5 different applications. So we had a really good stories and really compelling applications. Next slide, please. These are some resources for you to click on when you have the slide presentation, so you can kind of jump in and out and see different guides and tools to help you. And with that, I think I'm turning it over to Noemi Emmerich Ford from US EPA.
Thank you, Miriam. I'm Noemi Emmerich Ford, and I work for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and I am place-based in our Southern California field office, even though our main office is in San Francisco. And what I wanted to talk to you about today is a lot of money that US EPA has just come into, and specifically to our brownfields program. So you've read that right. It's $1.5 billion that is been dedicated to the EPA brownfields program, which will allow for opportunities across the nation for sites to be cleaned up and redeveloped, many of those being redeveloped into affordable housing. And so just to give you an idea, a lot of our funding is very similar to what the state has talked about, what Miriam has just described. And we have various different grant types, which I'll talk about in a second, but just wanted to let you know the 1.5 billion, 300 million of that will be specific set aside for just states and tribes. The remainder of the 1.2 billion will be used in grants and technical assistance to communities and entities such as those of you which are on the phone or in the webinar today. So I want to start with first, of course, we work for the federal government and we love acronyms just like EPA. We have a variety of different grant programs, and of those, we have 4 different grants that I'm going to talk about today that will be available for funding or applications in the fall. So the first one is a multi-purpose, the second is an assessment, the third, the RLF, stands for a revolving loan fund, and then fourth would be our cleanup. So we not only have the bipartisan infrastructure bill funding, but we also have our regular appropriations funding, which is going to give us approximately 370 million annually that we'll be able to distribute in grants and or technical assistance. So just to give you an idea of how big this is for us, is we normally have about 68 million available to us each year to be able to provide grants to. So this is much more money that we'll have to distribute to organizations or local governments or states across the nation. Eligible entities, Ignacio hit on this earlier. For our funding, it's all units of government, states, counties, local, tribes, redevelopment agencies, and then qualified 501c3 nonprofit organizations. The funding does need to be used for brownfields, but given the definition that Ignacio talked about earlier, brownfields is really perceived and or real contamination. So what we're trying to do is, if you walk anywhere throughout Southern California, you'll see a vacant lot and you wonder to yourself, why isn't that being redeveloped? Just the perception that something might be there, that there might be some environmental issues, can trigger some of our funding being used for that site. Our funding does allow for, unlike Miriam's funding that she talked about for the state, hazardous building materials, both the survey and abatement can be done with our resources. And of course, when we look to our funding, because our brownfields program, we want to make sure that a site is not just being cleaned up. We want to make sure that there's some productive and beneficial use that's going to happen once the site is cleaned up. So to give you an idea of the different grant types and the amount of funding that we might have, we haven't set the bipartisan infrastructure law. We haven't set the amount of our grant types just yet. I mentioned that the funding will be available in the fall, but that's what we're working through right now. The grant range will be anywhere from, for the multi-purpose, for 1 to 10 million. For the assessment grants, it'll be anywhere from 500,000 to 10 million. For the revolving loan fund, as you can see there, we're anticipating anywhere from 1 to 10 million. And then for cleanup grants, could be upwards to 5 million. So the thing that I wanted you to kind of hone in on here is that with our regular appropriations funding, there is a cost share that is required for our revolving loan fund and our cleanup grants. It's a 20% cost share, but it doesn't have to be in cash. It can be project management, it could be labor and materials, it could be a variety of different things. But under the bipartisan infrastructure law, the cost share has been removed. So I think that also is a big bonus for those who aren't able to complete projects having to do a cost share. The thing that we do require under our funding, which is different than the state's funding, is that the applicant who is applying for the funding must own the site. If they're conducting environmental assessments, they don't need to own the site, but they do need to be able to have access to the site to be able to perform the work. And so the owning the site for the cleanup grant, there are some nuances there. And I know oftentimes in nonprofit housing, the nonprofit affordable housing developer might have a private entity in an LLC with them. There are some instances where we're able to fund those applications where it may be in an LLC. We would just need to look at the ownership and who has the greater portion of the ownership, whether it's the private entity or the nonprofit entity. So for those who do the majority of their work under LLC or some type of partnership, I don't want you to think that you would be excluded from applying for our funding. So just on the multi-purpose grant, the getting into a little bit more specifics, this is funding that combines both conducting assessments as well as the remediation work. And so the idea is here, we're trying to make it easier for communities, particularly those who have suffered from environmental justice concerns within their community, to only have to apply to EPA once to get the work done that they're interested in. So you can use the funding to conduct the environmental assessments, both the phase 1 and phase 2. You can also use the funding to do your cleanup planning, and then ultimately use funding to conduct some of the cleanup work that might need to be done at the sites that you've identified. Our funding can also be used for feasibility studies, for redevelopment planning, land use planning. So there's a lot of flexibilities that are built into this funding. Right now, the range of funding is anywhere, as I mentioned earlier, from 500,000 to 10 million. I doubt it's going to go up to 10 million, but thinking somewhere within that $1 to $5 million range. So for our assessment grants, again, very similar to what Miriam has talked about. We have both community-wide and site-specific. One of the differences with our funding is that if you conduct a phase 1 environmental site investigation. It has to be on all appropriate inquiries. Phase one, which is just a few steps that you need to take. Most environmental consultants that you would hire would do this type of work anyway. Under our assessment grants, you can do cleanup planning, which are those remedial investigations. You can also use our funding if you're working with DTSC or another state entity. Let's say you're doing affordable housing in another state, to work with that state entity to pay for some of those costs that the state might charge you for having them review some of your documents. You can also use this money just to look at a particular area and see all these vacant lots we see, how many of those are contaminated, kind of conduct an inventory of those sites that might be vacant that you think are contaminated. This grant is usually 3 years. There are some flexibilities. We would prefer that the money be spent in 3 years, but it can go upwards to 5 years. And so this is another one that is, the grant range could go anywhere from 1 to 10 million. Right now, this particular grant program has always been set at $300,000. So our revolving loan fund, this is a grant program where we provide the funding to an entity, and then that entity loans the money out. So for instance, the state of California, DTSC, had this funding from EPA. They initially started out with $3 million, but each year, once you have these revolving loan funds, you can non-competitively apply for additional funding to put into the grant. So I think DTSC ended in totality with having close to $7 to $8 million that they received from EPA. And they used this funding to then give out loans and sub-grants for cleanups to eligible entities across the state. This right now is a grant range for $1 to $10 million. This is really for those entities that have partners who do financial planning, someone who could be your fund manager. And it's really where you're trying to set yourself up to be able to help maybe smaller or local government entities in your community to be able to get this funding, because they can't apply for grants themselves. So the cleanup grant, very similar to what Miriam talked about, very inherent in the name. It's the funding is used to be able to remediate sites, get them cleaned up so redevelopment can happen. You can use our funding to purchase environmental insurance if that's needed to cover some of the challenges that you might face on sites that are slightly more contaminated. This grant can range anywhere from 650 to 10 million. Right now, this grant has usually been in the $500,000 range, and you could cover multiple sites under this. If you apply for a cleanup grant, it doesn't have to just be one site. You can apply for several sites in one application and have them all covered under that grant. And so, Ignacio, were you going to take over from here, or did you want me? Yeah,
I can take over here.
Sure,
Yeah.
go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, so go ahead.
Yeah, well, before we switch gears, Noemi, there was a question in the chat for you, which was,
Sure.
Can EPA grants clean up on federal land?
Yes, so unfortunately cannot. So not on lands that are owned by the federal government. So if it is a former military site that is being transferred over, then those are, but if it's still under federal jurisdiction, the funding is not allowed, and that's statutory.
So when Noemi says statutory, it means it's in law, and EPA has no latitude in that. So you have to wait until the property is transferred. And normally the properties are transferred, quote unquote, clean for the use that they were, to the zoning or the use that it's currently at.
Right, but even if it's not, if properties are transferred from a federal to a unit, and even if it's contaminated, that's where our money, once it's transferred, that's where you can use our money. Because oftentimes if it's a military, they're only going to clean it up to the industrial standard. And if you want to put affordable housing, you're going to need to clean it up even more. And so that's where you could use our funding, but we'd need to wait till it gets out of the federal government title and over to another entity before our funds can be used.
And there was another one about being used on tribal land, if that's a possibility.
Absolutely. So our funding is definitely can be used for tribal lands. So I don't have a slide in here, but I wanted to talk about another grant program because it doesn't specifically relate to nonprofit affordable housing developers, but there's a grant that's called a state and tribal response program grant where it's non-competitive, where EPA provides funding. So for instance, the Department of Toxic Substances Control receives funding from US EPA to run their response program. So we give them funding where they in turn can also use that funding to assist nonprofit affordable housing developers. And that would be the same way with tribes. So tribes are eligible to apply for our funding. They can apply for this funding, all this funding that I've talked about, but they also are able to apply for this. We call it 128A because that's the number in the statute in the law, but it's called the 128A grant, where tribes can non-competitively request funding and they can use money to be able to build affordable housing. So yes, it can be on tribal land. Our monies can be used.
And so, yeah, there are just a few examples of grants on names of sites that have received this funding. It's only been recently, though, that nonprofits have been eligible for assessment grants. So most of these sites were either cleanup grants or were sub-granted from an RLF. Now there's much more opportunity for nonprofits to apply for these funds. So next slide, Miriam. Noemi. So again, here's again a laundry list of sites of activities that you can fund under both programs. Again, some outreach, especially related to the cleanup activity, would be covered. An inventory, if you're a nonprofit and you're working a neighborhood or a district, you can actually use this for an inventory. It used to be that cities did inventories, but there's no reason why a nonprofit can't do it, or even if SCANF was up to it or a group of nonprofits, they could do that also. Schematic design that is associated with the cleanup planning. So anything related to that will eventually be informing an assessment or cleanup. And we've talked about all the other stuff. One thing that Noemi or Miriam didn't mention are, to a certain extent, expenses for a soil vapor extraction system up to a certain time could be covered. Again, it's all in devil's in the details here. And so here are key dates. So there's still time to apply for the April 4th deadline, though you do have to jam and you have to have everything in place, unless, particularly if you're doing a site-specific or a cleanup grant. If you plan to apply for an area-wide grant, a community-wide grant, now's the time to start to do it and contact CClear. And of course, there are future rounds of funding. As Noemi said, the EPA grants will be announced and be out in September and will be due in November. And next year, the ECRG will come around again. And we'll be discussing all of these at the California Land Recycling Conference in Carson. A little bit about CClear. We're a nonprofit. Again, our services are free on a programmatic level to nonprofits. So we've helped most of those nonprofits who obtain grants in the West Coast obtain these grants. And our grant review is free. And we are also a grant assistance provider for DTSC as well. Next slide. And here's that information about what we do for communities. And again, these slides will be made available. Please come to the California Land Recycling Conference in Carson. It'll be informative and fun. And of course, the national conference in Oklahoma in August. So I think that's it. And we're happy to take any more questions.
There was one in the chat about the EPA funds, if they can be used in rural disaster areas as well.
Yes, they can. So in those, just as a reminder that the EPA funds, in order to use for brownfield, so there needs to be a perceived kind of notion of contamination. So in those disaster areas where, let's say by fire, if there were household hazardous materials or other things, or lead and asbestos in the buildings, those would all qualify as perceptions of contamination then in those areas where disasters have taken place. And so the funding is not about kind of needs to be done for assessment. So it's not a demolition program. So we have had others like, oh, I want to use the funding just to remove all of this debris from a disaster area. That wouldn't qualify on its own by itself. You'd need to have a larger plan for using the funding for conducting assessment and then trying to reuse the land. But if you have instances like that, I'm happy to talk to you a little bit more in depth about what would make an application competitive so that you could get the resources.
Great. Are there any more questions? Actually, I just want to share with the the attendees that these grants are getting the programs or the grant applications are getting more creative because the applications are different. We're very heavy now, focusing on climate change and environmental justice. And we have another question here. Noemi mentioned that LLC are not excluded from receiving grants. Can she explain?
Right. So in our, so if you noticed on the slides, there was a definition that said 501c3. So there are in EPA's funding, we do have some, I don't have the wording directly in front of me, but there are some instances where you would have a partnership established, because what we recognized was that nonprofit affordable housing developers will typically have a private developer in partnership with them, and they've developed this LLC or LLP, limited liability partnership. So what EPA will look at is how much percentage does the nonprofit own. So for instance, we looked at one in San Diego where the nonprofit only owned like 10% and the remainder was by the private developer. That was not deemed eligible. Right. So remember, it's public funding. And so we need to give it to nonprofit or public entities, not to private entities directly. So I think if you have an LLC or an LLP set up where the nonprofit affordable housing developer has the majority of the interest in the partnership, then those sites would likely be eligible. If it's the private entity, it probably would not. I hope that answers the question.
Any other questions? I think there's someone with a raised hand here. Valentino has a hand raised. Valentino, if we can't unmute, can you type your question in, Valentino? And Ramon has a question too.
If you have your hands raised, go ahead to the Q&A box and then we can go through there. Oh, we see that Valentino wrote in the Q&A box, if you get the grant, do you do the work or does the state have to do the work?
All right. Actually, let me, Noemi has a grant where the EPA can do the work, but maybe Noemi can explain that.
So, because I think there are two different grant types we talk about. So just speaking of the funds that EPA has talked about, so all of the funding, if you get a grant from us, it is money that comes directly to the entity that is applying. And you as an entity can contract with a environmental consultant or another party to do the work for you. And it could be that you're partnering with the state to oversee the program, but it is not required. The only thing we require is that you have to have a certified regulatory agency oversee your cleanup, because we want to make sure that it's done and that it's protective of human health and the environment. So that would cover our funds. Ignacio, what you were getting ready to talk about, there wasn't a slide specifically for that. So I don't want to confuse people on that particular resource since I didn't talk about it, but I'll let Miriam answer in case that question was directed for the state grants.
Well, actually, so there's Miriam.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
The question was, does the state have to do the work if they get a grant?
Yeah, no, they don't.
Right. This is money for you. This is money in your pockets, as opposed to free technical assistance, or what they call no, Noemi was going to talk about this program, but let's save. Are there still funds available, Noemi? Should you mention it?
Yeah, so I at this point, because the I guess so I was trying not to steal Miriam's thunder, since her application is coming up on November 4th, and we want people to apply for the state's resources. US EPA does have a program where we have consultants on retainer that if you do not have the ability yourself to apply for a grant, nor do you have the staff that could manage a grant within your program, and you just needed to know if a site was contaminated and what the cost of cleanup would be, we have a program at EPA that's called our Targeted Brownfields Assessment Program. It's a quick 2-page application that's online that you can fill in, and we have our consultant who will conduct that work for you. And so that will tell you whether the site is contaminated or not. That might be helpful for nonprofit affordable housing developers before you even purchase the land, right? Giving you that reassurance of how much those costs would be. If you have scouted some sites in advance, that's something we can do. And we have a lot of money for that. So if you have something like that and you're interested in, so Ariana and Jeanette, I know you guys maybe you could serve as a conduit, get the information to me, and we could talk more about some of those sites, but we definitely have the resources to be able to provide that assistance.
I want to say on DTSC's, from DTSC's perspective, we used to have a program like that, but right now we're really focusing on the ECRG and trying to get people to use those funds. But like Noemi said, we don't do the work. You get reimbursed for the work that you do, or hire contractors, to do the work.
All right, there's a clarification here. This actually applies to both Miriam and Noemi. Mm-hmm. Affordable housing projects using low-income housing tax credits often have ownership structures where a private investor has majority ownership, but the nonprofit developer still retains control over the management and operation of the project. Would a project with this structure qualify?
Okay. So that's really more for me, because remember, with the state funding, you don't have to own the site. So I would say if you have those structures in place, to be honest with you, you need to apply for state funding, and you'd get a lot more likely under the state funding. I don't want to say do not apply for EPAs, but since the state has funding now, and their application process is much easier. It's an online application process, where the federal government, you do have to put pen to paper, and it is a little bit more of a lengthy process. But I don't ever want to say no until I know all of the details. So what you have just described and the question that you read to me, Ignacio, hearing that sounds like it's not eligible, but there might be some nuances in the definition of the nonprofit kind of overseeing that, because ownership can also be, if you're overseeing a project that is over 65 years, right, and you're going to retain that, that's like fee simple title, right? So there could be some nuances in that. So I would just say that if you have those instances and you're interested in applying for EPA funding, let's have a private conversation so we can determine, as opposed to just excluding yourself completely from our funding.
One other thing we didn't mention is that the state does have what's called the revolving loan fund that we didn't talk about here also. But question for Noemi: if the state obtained more funding for the RLF, would that have been eligible for a sub grant?
Right. So the RLF is no longer, that grant's closed out.
All right. Okay. So it's no longer.
So yeah. So there are some that. So the idea is that, okay, what's eligible under a revolving loan fund would be the same thing that's eligible coming to EPA, because our eligibility requirements follow through all our funding. So it depends for that program, as well as their other funding, would all be the same. But I feel like we try to get to yes as much as we can. So understanding the various nuances of a project are really important. So I guess I'll just leave you with, don't discount yourself, and make sure that you talk to us about the nuances of your particular project, because there's a lot of money out there and we want to be able to provide the assistance.
And again, I don't want to downplay. I mean, please apply for Noemi's for Miriam's funding if you can, because and please take a look at it, because the program can change, especially if it does not fit your purpose. If there are like several nonprofits or cities that say have comments on the program, DTSC will consider those for the next round. So
That's
just
absolutely
for the sake of being able to change the program to suit your needs is good to just get into the system.
Which would not happen at a federal level unless you talk to your politicals and get the law changed. So that would be much more difficult. So yeah.
Yeah, but from our perspective, we are very open to taking comments for consideration for next round. This is a very new effort for us, and I think we're still in a way figuring out who we are and how we can best help. And so in that regard, when we are going through the applications, as Ignacio mentioned, our application closes on the 4th of April, we are of course very interested in the eligible applications. We are also very interested in the applications that don't get funded, because we want to understand what that universe looks like and if there is a way for us to increase our capacity to take even more projects on the next round.
Okay, how about this question? Oh gosh. So these there are regional agencies that have these funds, and is there any way to fit anything about the housing element and something that the cities are doing now, the RENA, that could be plugged into a community-wide assessment, either from the EPA or DTSC?
I mean, I think that it can. You know, it's all in how that application is written. It certainly is something that we would welcome seeing as an application that comes in. We're not able to say what will get funded and what we won't, because there's many variables associated with that. But that general concept is something that we would definitely want to see represented in our application pool.
Okay, actually, there's a question here in the chat. Go ahead, Noemi.
I was just going to say, from a federal perspective, sure. I mean, you know, the idea is under our grant programs, we understand that not everyone, our grant process is to apply for a grant is much more difficult than the state, right? So you have to fill in. So we're looking for larger jurisdictions to be able to apply for funding and assist kind of in this effort. And then maybe it's a nonprofit affordable housing developer that does it with a larger redevelopment agency. But yes, it could be eligible with our funding.
Yeah, one just to let folks know, I noticed someone here was from SCAG, and ABAG got one of these grants in for priority development areas near transit. So really, TOD was funded. TOD sites were funded under the program. The question here from Ramon is, how do these grants benefit the public directly beyond the obvious need for toxic site cleanup, when these funds are only available to those who have the power, means, and ability to already own land? Okay, that's one, the land ownerships. And then the means and the ability to, and context, he works for a community that does community gardens, and I'm guessing they don't purchase the sites.
Right. So I can answer from an EPA standpoint. So the ownership of the land is only tied to our remediation funding, right? So if you are applying for cleanup funding, or you're applying for funding from an entity that has a revolving loan fund, that's the only time we require ownership of the land. The state in their program, the ECRG, you do not have to own the site. We have other forms like our assessment grants. So for instance, if it's an affordable, like a garden, you wouldn't have to own the sites. You would just have to work with the owners of the site to give you access. So we would not be using any authority that we have as the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to go in and force someone to allow the assessment to happen. But if you have relationships with property owners, you can conduct the assessments and you don't have to own the property. So that's one way it can help communities who don't have the ability to own land. The second is all of these grants have the opportunity to conduct community engagement. So you can use a portion of the funding to do community visioning, to do community outreach. You can also use a portion of the funding for redevelopment planning, to draw up schematics for maybe what the garden would look like, what the site might be reused at. Maybe you're partnering with a county agency on building a park to help look at how you can design some schematics around that. So I feel like there's several ways that you can use the funding. And just for Ariana and Jeanette, we do have some other resources that EPA has that we didn't have time to talk about. Didn't want to make it too confusing. There's a lot of other resources that we can provide. I have a kind of one-page fact sheet that I could share with you, and maybe you could share it with your membership, and then folks could call us if they have interest from that.
And I think Miriam had something to add on this topic.
Sure. I was just going to say what we've already mentioned, that for the ECRG, we're not requiring ownership. We are really welcoming of partnerships between owners and non-owners. And we decided to take this approach specifically for situations where under-resourced organizations are not able to take on ownership for various reasons.
Okay, Valentino has a follow-up email message here. If the LLC and nonprofit is the managing general partner, why would they be disallowed? If you are doing a tax credit program, the equity partner comes in as the limited partner and the nonprofit is the managing partner. We must certify that we are controlling the project from the conception through construction.
Right. So for that's probably targeted towards EPA. So remember, we're operating off of a law, off of a statute, and we don't have the flexibility to change that. The law was actually written to say that you have to have fee simple title ownership of the land. We have now determined, after hearing a lot of feedback from the public, that fee simple title ownership of the land can be done in different nuances, but it's a legalese to make sure that it matches the statute. So that's why I said long-term ownership. There's been some designation that, you know, something after 65 after 65 years is an equivalent to fee simple title ownership. There are some instances where the equity in a project can be equated to fee simple title ownership. Management of a project is not about ownership of a property. And so I think that's where the statute and some of the legalese is, where I don't represent EPA as an attorney, so I can't specifically answer that, but I'll tell you that's where it's based on. That's why I said it depends. So I would say, if you are interested in EPA money and you have projects like that, come to us, and I can bring it to one of our attorneys to get the information that's needed to see if it's eligible.
Well, great. I think we have to wrap up now. Thank you so much for your questions. Thank you to SCANF for hosting it, and please keep in touch. And thank you all for those who are attending. Noemi and Miriam, thanks for a great job, and hope to see you folks at these conferences. Please keep in touch.